Welcome to the night session of Asan Plenum 2019. Today's night session is going to be about North Korea's choice, economic reform. The moderator for this session is Dr. Myong-Hyun, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Go?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Myong-Hyun. I'm a research fellow at the Asan Institute. Thank you so much for coming. So such a late time tonight. I mean, 9 p.m. and looks like you're all awake, and hopefully you had a nice dinner too. Because also I hope that you had a couple of drinks before coming here, because you need it. We're going to talk about the North Korean economy, and we know that the North Korean economy has become the focus of the negotiations between the United States and North Korea. We know that President Trump loves sanctions. He wants to keep them. But then the problem, though, is that we are not sure what are the impacts of sanctions on the North Korean economy and also on the North Korean population. And to confound the matter further, we are not sure whether sanctions will ultimately be able to force Kim Jong-un to change his policy of nuclear development. So to answer all these questions tonight, we have a terrific panel. But on an announcement, we had Professor Hazel Smith as one of the panel members, but then she's feeling unwell right now. I don't think it's not anything serious, but then we decided for prudence to let her go back to her room to take some rest. So tonight I'll be taking her role as well, answering some of the questions that she was planning to answer. And in addition to that, we have even better panel members here, so I want to introduce them in turn. So first we have Tom Byrne. He's the president of the Korea Society in New York City. He's an old Korea hand, and he's an expert in the North Korean economy and finance. Next to him, we have Mr. Furukawa. He's a former member of the UN panel of experts. He's been investigating North Korea's sanctions evasion for a long, long time, and he's still working on this issue. And now he's an independent researcher based in Japan, and he published a best-selling book on North Korea in Japan. And I think it's actually quite a high-ranked sale item in Amazon Japan. So if you know Japanese, please go to Amazon Japan website, amazon.jp, and look him up and buy a book, and then he'll send you a coupon for drinks. And last but not least, we have John Park. He's a senior researcher at Harvard Belfer Center. He's a well-known Korean expert. I mean, not just North Korean issues, but also the Korean regional issues, Korean politics. He knows absolutely everything in many ways. So we're going to test his knowledge tonight. So I have in store a very tough question for him to answer, maybe impossible to answer, but then we'll see. So before we go in, some housekeeping matters. So we are giving ourselves maximum 10 minutes each to answer some of the questions that I prepare for myself and for the rest of the panel. Then we may follow up with follow-up questions or open up the floor to the questions. So we'll get started, and then I'll start with myself. So I think you all have this handout in front of you. I didn't prepare this. Professor Smith prepared this for her presentation. And as you can see, this is about the nutrition status of children in North Korea. And you also have a nice map of North Korea. I know this because actually I worked on these kind of issues myself. And these are a very actually interesting data set. This data set comes from North Korea itself. And this is probably the one of the few data sets that's available from North Korea that has this time series kind of a nature. So these are observations over time. So you can compare before and after of some phenomena in North Korea. In this particular case, the case in that this data set is following is about the nutritional status of children in North Korea. As you know, North Korea suffered from a terrible famine in the 1990s, and millions of people supposedly have died from the famine. But one of the lasting consequences of the famine happened to be the stunting of the children in North Korea. You might have seen the pictures of North Korean children, stunted growth, being low height and low weight. And so the UNICEF and the UN agency in charge of children's welfare has been tracking this issue over a long time, actually since 1998. And you see on the table on the lower right corner that there are, year date and then there's a indicator of stunting and wasting, and the percentages, right? So the percentage you see here under like stunting, for instance, in 1998, it says 62%. Actually, 62% happen to be about the proportion of North Korean children suffering from low weight. That's right. And 16%, this is actually a more important indicator of starvation and nutritional status of children. And then 16% of North Korean children were suffering from a serious malnutrition. So, but if you see that over time, these numbers have been decreasing, which is good. And by 2017, the last year that North Koreans and the UNICEF conducted this survey, the indicators have improved dramatically. So right now, and I mean, not right now, but back in 2017, 2 years ago, the numbers show that only 19% of North Korean children, only qualified, quote unquote, suffer from stunting, and only 3% of children suffer from wasting. For reference, these are numbers that are better than the ones that you see in Pakistan and India. So herein lies a paradox. So North Korean children's nutrition, supposedly the most vulnerable segment of the population, have been experiencing improvement in their living standards. But at the same time, we have a very strong sanctions regime in place. So this was supposed to be my question for Professor Smith, but she's not here, so maybe we can stop here. But then I can venture to guess why this is happening, why we see this contradictory pattern in the North Korean economy. We see improvement on the hand, but then we see sanctions that are getting stronger and stronger over time. So, I mean, we don't have enough time to go into all the details, but I think what's really going on in North Korea is pretty straightforward. North Korean regime under Kim Jong-un is different from his father's regime. His father, Kim Jong-il, didn't really care about his own people. He was happy to let those people, I mean, his own people, to starve and die. Whereas Kim Jong-un, it looks like he's spending his own money to keep up a minimum level of living standards. So we know this from other indicators that are not here, such as the price of rice and the foreign exchange rate in North Korea that are reported by informers working with South Korean NGOs. They report this market prices of rice and US dollars exchange rate every twice a month or something. Actually, it's all open. It's on the website called dailynk.com, so you can check it yourself. So if you look at the price trend in North Korea, this key indicator like a rice and a foreign exchange rate, actually has been very stable in the last couple of years. In case of rice, for instance, the price decreased this year. So we know, but at the same time, North Korean harvest record has been horrendous. FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, reported that the food production shortfall this year will be 1.5 million tons out of 5 million tons of production that they achieved this year. So we have a huge gap in production, but improvement in the nutritional status and stability in the price of key commodities. So only way we can explain this is that North Korea is using different ways to, including the government, to mitigate the impact of sanctions and mitigate the impact of starvation, shortages of food. So in a way, it shows that the North Koreans North Koreans individually have coping mechanisms. The regime itself is spending more money to keep up the living standards. So this creates the room for North Korea to withstand the negative impact of sanctions with state intervention. So this is I think it's a very important point here. So, but the question is, though, whether North Korea will be able to sustain this pace of fending off the pressure of sanction in the long run. And I toss those questions to the rest of the panel, and then the next question goes to Katsu-san about the impact of sanctions in North Korea and how sanctions are working, and if you can talk about that a little bit, and now what are the roles of the neighboring countries to North Korea in implementing sanctions or helping North Korea evade them.
Since 2016, the UN sanction regime transformed its objective. Original UN sanction regime was aimed at It was named as target sanction, which was aimed at terminating the transfer of funds, goods, and personnel that are directly connected to weapons program. That was the UN sanction regime as we knew until early 2016. After that, United States began to change the objective UN sanction regime. And currently, the UN sanction regime has shifted to effectively, it's aimed at virtual embargo against North Korea. Therefore, North Korea's legal trading activity, a majority of them are currently prohibited under UN Security Council resolution. So under these conditions, there are many North Korean traders or people who are claiming that they are no longer able to do business. They're having financial troubles. So if the question is whether the sanction regime effectively affected North Korean economy, of course, United States, Japan, or other countries are punching North Korea over and over again. And if you are not feeling pain, what are you? You are feeling pain. But the problem, the question is, does that affect the stability of Kim Jong-un regime? Or is it guiding Kim Jong-un to really pursue denuclearization path? And in this regard, I have to say that the existing data set is not supporting the hypothesis that Kim Jong-un regime is having significant trouble in maintaining his regime. And there are not so much credible data set with respect to North Korean economy. But let me give you some figures from US government document, which was published on March 21 of this year. According to this document, last year in 2018, US government confirmed at least 263 tanker deliveries of refined petroleum, which was procured from ship-to-ship transfer. Foreign vessel on the sea transfer oil product to North Korean tanker, and this tanker delivered the petroleum product to North Korean ports 263 times last year. The ship-to-ship transfer has been prohibited by UN Security Council resolution. Nonetheless, North Korea was doing this on average once in a day and a half. And according to this official US estimate, if these tankers, oil tankers are full of oil refined product, if it's loaded with a full capacity, the US estimate goes that North Korea would have imported 3.78 million barrels of oil. I don't think you have a clue about what does this mean. 3.78 million barrels. Originally, US government estimated that in 2016, prior to the institution of oil embargo against North Korea was procuring about 4.5 million barrels. And UN Security Council resolution significantly decreased the amount of petroleum product that North Korea is allowed to procure down to 0.5 million barrel. So originally 4.5 million, down to 0.5 million. That was the objective of UN sanction regime. But according to the official US figure, there is a possibility that North Korea managed to acquire almost 85% of the amount of petroleum product that they were procuring in the previous year. So this means that North Korea appears to have acquired significant amount of oil product, regardless of the UN sanction regime. And what is more noteworthy is the fact that when North Korea purchases oil product, they have to pay for that. How do they pay with a foreign currency? I'm sure they're paying in the form of coal in the form of illegal export of coal in violation of UN sanction, UN Security Council resolutions. Currently, North Korea is no longer allowed to export coal, but nonetheless, there are a significant amount of cargo vessels that were identified by the US government to transport coals of North Korean origin to countries abroad. So if you look at the macro situation of North Korea, the country must be going through negative economic growth. And there are many people who are affected, particularly those closely related to market transaction people. They must be suffering. But from the perspective of Kim Jong-un regime, it appears that he still maintains significant ability to acquire refined petroleum and in exchange export prohibited strategic commodity, particularly coal, to many other countries. And in addition, North Korea is meeting with the current difficulty by deepening its commitment into criminal activities, particularly the cyber attack operations. There are multiple cases identified by the US FBI that North Korea-sponsored hacker group has successfully acquired a significant amount of foreign currency from abroad. Early last year, in Japan, there was the cryptocurrency exchange platform was attacked. And the amount of money stolen from there was almost equivalent to $580 million equivalent currency. This is almost like a 30% of the estimate of the North Korean export of 2017. So single cyber operation through single cyber operation, North Korea acquired foreign currency, actually cryptocurrency, which is almost equivalent to the amount of 30% of the North Korean entire export of year 2017. So North Korea appears to maintain still certain capability to acquire foreign currency and also developing new methods to acquire foreign currency. And cyber security, you can name so many countries which still remain weak today. These are all weak spots that still remain, you can observe throughout the world. But these foreign currency acquired by the Kim Jong-un regime through illegal cyber attack operation doesn't necessarily mean that North Korean people who are doing market activities can thrive or survive based on those money. I don't know how the stolen monies are distributed within the North Korean system, but nonetheless, it appears to me that North Korea as a whole is certainly feeling pain. The Kim Jong-un regime appears to maintain certain ability to acquire impressive amount of foreign currency. As time goes by, however, I'm sure same cyber attack operation could not be conducted successfully as more countries begin to learn how to protect their cyber system. So hypothetically, the more time passes, the pain may increase on the part of North Korea. But remember, North Korea is not a democratic country. All you need to do is to secure certain amount of resources to control North Korean military through North Korean internal security force. In the social science arena, the most important point to prevent regime change is to keep grip on your military. And so long as you're successful, you can go after Venezuela model. If you fail, you're going to be the president of Algeria or Sudan, as you see today. When the military revolt, it's the end of your regime. But so far, I see no indication that internal security force or military force is revolting against Kim Jong at all. And just one final remark. The smuggling operation or money laundering operation or these kind of cyber operations involve North Korean agents dispatched to foreign countries, as well as their foreign collaborators, which are situated in so many who are located in so many countries around the world. And I think even in South Korea, you should have those people. In Japan, we also have North Korean collaborators. China, Russia, there are many more. The United States government began strongly monitoring the transaction between North Korea and China since 2017. After that, the Chinese businessmen began to shift their operation base to other countries. So today, I'm finding Chinese person of interest whom I have been investigating since when I was in the UN panel of experts. I was investigating those sanction violation incidents. And some Chinese person of interest are now establishing company in Japan, in the heart of Tokyo. South Korea or other countries may look into who are registering or establishing companies in your territory. Once those people have, the Chinese people does not operate only from China. There are North Korean collaborators in Japan, South Korea, Russia, Southeast Asia. They coordinate with each other to enable single operations because it involves multiple jurisdictions across multiple countries. Most of them have not been attributed by any law enforcement authorities. This is a reality today. So terminating this illegal network constructed by North Korea is not as easy as you may presume. Sanction regime, UN sanction regime can be so effective, only so much, to the extent that member states really implement those sanction regime. But today, I don't think a majority of member states are not as serious as they are supposed to be.
Great. You said that this was your final remark, but I wanted to keep you on the spot just a little bit longer, because I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more about the role of the neighboring countries, such as not just China and Russia, but we just heard from Katsuhisa about Japan and South Korea. For instance, in South Korea, we know that South Korean government investigated 3 coal importing companies in Korea that imported coal supposedly from Russia, but happened to be North Korean coals. And we also know that a couple of South Korean oil tankers are under United Nations and US watch list for having supposedly been involved in the illegal ship-to-ship transfer of oil products. So my question is, if the sanctions have so many holes and that there's so many actors helping North Korea evade the sanctions, so are sanctions really working? You mentioned that North Korea has been able to make up for the 85% of the oil that they used to import before the sanctions came into effect through this illicit means of procuring oil. So are you hopeful that the sanctions are going to having the impact that they are designed to have?
Very briefly, sanctions are making more costly for North Korea to conduct business activities, external business activities. That's for sure. But sanctions are not able to terminate North Korea's illegal activities because there are always those companies or individuals who find significant business opportunities in engaging in illegal transactions with North Korea. The key word here is repeat offenders. For a majority of incidents of violation of North Korea, a violation of the UN sanction regime, same people or same company keep appearing. This means that these people have never felt the risk of doing business with North Korea, but instead, they find it as a significant business opportunity still, wide open. So what we need to do is the number of people or companies who are really assisting North Korea's illegal activities are not so dramatically wide. In most cases, the same people establish many front companies in tax haven states. And it's just that we haven't come to the point to prohibit the activities as yet, and that's a challenge.
So that's a very important point, I believe. I mean, sanctions are making North Korea's procurement of necessities more costly, but not impossible. So as long as North Korea has money, North Korea will be able to sustain their economy. Maybe that's the reason why they've been able to sustain the living standards of the people in North Korea. So that's a very important point. So that's actually also a very nice segue to go to John, actually. And here's the tough question that I'm going to ask John, which is, sure, like sanctions have some sort of impact on the North Korean economy, for instance, by making procurement of strategic goods and the necessities more costly, thereby forcing North Korea to spend the money much faster. But the question is, the way we think about sanctions is that sanctions is going to cause pain in the ordinary people in the country. And the ordinary people feel the pain. They're going to influence the ruling class, the leadership, to change their policy that's, giving cause to the sanctions policy. But that's in a normal country. I mean, living standards, the decreasing living standards, isolation leads to policy change. But in North Korea, does the same logic apply? Given that North Korea is a different country in many ways. Maybe, Katsuhisa mentioned several times during his presentation, but, Kim Jong-un might not care. At the end of the day, I said Kim Jong-un cares about his people more than his father did, but there's no guarantee that he's going to change his mind down the road. So if that's the case, is sanctions the right way? Is there a clear link between impact of sanctions and the possibility of North Korea changing their ways?
Sure. Dr. Go, thank you, and thank you to the Asan Institute for having me here today. Thank you for your questions. I think in terms of how to address this, if there's one thing I would like to leave the audience with, is the concept of North Korea Incorporated. The idea of applying sanctions on the North Korean regime is not new. And as we've heard Katsu mention, and as we've seen in the press and a lot of documentation, North Korea is now the focus of a very integrated sanctions regime. This is something that is a new reality. But what I wanted to do is gravitate your attention away from North Korea as a country and focus on North Korea as a 1% phenomenon and a 99% phenomenon. My remarks are about the 1%, the elites. And within this, if you think of the North Korean state trading companies and how they've gone abroad, particularly into the Chinese marketplace in Southeast Asia, the increasing application of sanctions, and this is very counterintuitive, has sparked innovation. My colleague, Dr. Jim Walsh at MIT and I, we conducted a 3-year study looking at how the application of sanctions for this narrow 1% has raised costs, has made it more risky to do business with North Korean entities, and certainly has scared off some of the local private companies. But for those who are incentivized by the risk, they seek out North Korean clients. They're basically charging higher commission fees to the procurement on behalf of North Korean clients. And that has led to the type of enhanced effectiveness for North Korea Incorporated. This is a dilemma, because if you look at the period of 2017, as North Korea conducted tests that broke through these technological barriers, the question of how North Korea procured these banned items is still an inconvenient fact. It's still a puzzle that I think merits more research. But one thing to look at are these commercial channels, which in many respects constitute dual-use technology. Once you develop these commercial channels, it becomes much more easier to procure these illicit items that make their way into North Korea. So with Dr. Ko's question, the link, I think one way to envision it is if you imagine sanctions as antibiotics. By applying more and more antibiotics, by applying more and more sanctions on this very narrow sliver of the elite North Korean regime, we have essentially created a superbug. This is a type of element of the regime where certainly sanctions have an impact on other parts of the 99% and the 1%, but with this particular piece of it, North Korea Incorporated, we're looking at this elevated risk, this monetization of risk, and essentially a market approach to how the North Korean regime has adapted. So let me conclude with 2 points and then move it on, save some time for the Q&A component. But the 2 pieces in terms of implications. One is that the belief that by applying more and more sanctions, it increases our opportunity to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table in our terms. We have to fundamentally revisit that. That could have been the case years before, but there is something of a tipping point in terms of where we are today. The second implication is the view that if you look at it from a business lens, this is not just a function of North Korean state trading companies becoming good, it's their local private business partners in different jurisdictions in Southeast Asia and China. And this is an element where if you look at the local marketplace, North Korean clients are not viewed as criminals or illicit agents on behalf of the North Korean regime. They're just viewed as expat business people. And that's the element that when you look at the broader scope of how we are going about cutting off revenue streams, looking at these different types of North Korean state trading companies in different jurisdictions, it's the embedded nature of these North Korean businessmen, if you will, in these areas that has created a situation where it's no longer North Korea's choice, but North Korea's decision. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. And then I think that really leads to Tom, because I think John essentially described North Korean economy as a hybrid system. I mean, hybrid in the sense that it has the illicit component and illicit component. There are agents of North Korea operating in different parts of the world, especially in this region in Northeast Asia, masquerading as a legal business person. But then at the end of the day, they are aiding the regime economically. So essentially, we know because of the external factors, North Korea has become a monster in many ways, adapting to the pressure. But then, in a way, it's deviating from the normal path of economic development. So in that sense, well, that sounds very like gloomy and all that. But in order to inject some sort of optimism here, we're going to turn to Tom, and then hopefully, can shed more light to an alternative path of development for North Korea.
Well, North Korea's made a bad choice to develop its military nuclear weapons program rather than its economy. Even before the comprehensive sanctions were put into place in early 2016, I mean, North Korea was stuck in a low-income trap. We talk about middle-income traps, like Malaysia is a good example. But North Korea's been in a low-income trap, a very low-income trap, since 1990. Now, these statistics, I mean, I don't know what to do with this, the ones that you mentioned, because we have World Bank surveys and a whole bunch of other surveys. There's no consistency in reporting, so I think these are analytically useless, actually. But if you look at, actually, Citibank in Hong Kong, Kim Jin-wook did a very nice study. And before the sanctions were enacted in 2016, if you look at some basic economic indicators such as refining capacity, power generation, road expansion, expressway expansion, there's been no improvement since 1990. So since 1990, forget about the per capita income figures, which are really low, although we don't have national accounts in North Korea, so we really don't know what the per capita income is. We don't know if it's higher than Nepal, lower than Nepal, higher than Pakistan, lower than Pakistan. But we do know that North Korea has only been refining a certain amount of oil since 1970. It's been constant. Power generation hasn't moved. Rail and road expansion is basically non-existent since 1990. So North Korea is in this low-income trap, and that's been the decision of the Kim. 1990 was Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un's maybe trying to do something a little different, but basically he hasn't embraced on any sort of systematic economic reform policy. The reform from below, the incentives given to factory managers and farmers is really meaningless in terms of moving North Korea ahead economically. So I think we're still in this situation where the Byung-jin policy is really, it doesn't really mean anything. It's really Juche and Sungun and all of that. I mean, even if you look at the New Year speech given by Kim Jong-un, Juche is mentioned, I forget how many times, and socialism many times, but market economy, economic reform isn't mentioned at all. So we're not at a point, the sanctions won't look at the political and the strategic aspects, but we're not at a point where North Korea has decided to embrace reform. In fact, what I would use as a marker for embracing reform is what any other transitional economy has done. When China decided to embrace reform, when the Socialist Republic of Vietnam decided to embrace reform in 1986, when the Russian Federation collapsed and decided to embrace reform, and Mongolia had its democratic revolution, they all joined the IMF within a year, about. They joined the WTO a bit later, depending on the country, but North Korea is really not at this point where it's seriously considering economic reform. It's still trapped in this, well, it's still in this very low income trap, and I don't see it moving beyond that. And so sanctions evasion and all that is really a side story. Maybe it allows North Korea to muddle through, but so North Korea's been in this low income trap since 1990, 3 decades. You know, how long will it last? Another decade, who knows?
So what will be the change that could be brought about by North Korea gaining the membership to the International Monetary Fund? What kind of consequences?
Well, now they have the problem. They have to they have to give up their nuclear weapons.
Of course.
They didn't have that problem before when they first approached the IMF and the ADB, but now they have that problem.
Okay, so let's say like North Korea gives up nuclear weapons, and that's what President Trump says. President Trump, after having met with Kim Jong-un, apparently concluded that Kim Jong-un is willing to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for economic development, full-scale economic development, like Vietnam and other former communist states are engaged. So, but you are saying that that's not going to be the case because North Korea is engaged in systematic malpractice of economic policies, and they're not showing any indication that they're going to change that policy, right?
Right. It's their choice. They're not making that choice yet.
Okay. So I was hoping for some injection of optimism, but I think I will continue with the gloomy state. So this is like a first round of questions that I prepared for the panel, and then so far it looks like the overall consensus is North Korea is not suffering that much under the sanctions, not because sanctions.
Well, I would say they are suffering a lot.
Yeah.
They always have been suffering, except for the elite in Pyongyang. Maybe John or you know something more than I do, but.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
Yeah, but then not so much because.
But they're muddling through. Yeah. So how long can they muddle through?
Yeah, sanctions are not ineffective, but at least some of the impacts of sanctions are being mitigated by the regime, which has adapted to all these extreme conditions imposed by the international community because of North Korea's nuclear development. So in a way, it looks like the consensus is that North Korea is going to be able to muddle through for the foreseeable future, which has implication for denuclearization negotiations. Correct. So with that gloomy note, I'm sorry about that, but then I'll be getting questions from the floor. Okay. So yes, Simon? And then also identify yourself for the benefit of the audience.
So Simon Denyer from the Washington Post. I mean, simple question actually, really just keying off what Thomas was saying. How long can North Korea muddle through? I'd be interested to see what range of views the kind of panel has. 10 years, 20 years, 50 years?
If it continues like this, without changing, with the sanctions regime, which is, inadequately policed, can it survive indefinitely, or is the clock in the modern world, is the clock really ticking to some kind of collapse?
Well, that's a good question. I'm going to
maybe ask everyone to give a number. I don't know.
This is a great question for a night session. Night session is supposed to be, like informal and challenging. And I mean, I'm sorry we have a camera there, but then it's, we can be very forthcoming about what we think. So, but because I'm the moderator, I'm going to use the prerogative as a moderator and deflect the question to the rest of the panel first. Yeah. So who's going to volunteer? Who would like to? Tom?
There was an American economist, his name was Herbert Stein. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors. And what I tell the students that I teach in terms of sovereign risk is that if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. So how long can North Korea exist in this very low income trap? I guess is either you said it or somebody, as long as the military is loyal to the leader, then maybe it could go on, but that doesn't always work forever, because if you look at the lesson of the Arab Spring, I think it's when the military separated themselves from the leader, such as Ben Ali in Tunisia and with Mubarak, that the country didn't completely spiral into chaos as it did in Libya and Syria, where the military stayed loyal to the leader. But there, I think you're into this question of, do you have rising expectations in North Korea? Are they informed about their relative poverty compared to the Chinese and the South Koreans? I think in the 1990s that wasn't the case. And maybe now it is. So I would say, I don't know if you're asking us to give 5 years, 10 years, 20 years estimate, but I would say that at some point the system has to collapse.
But the sanctions should remain in place as they are.
Well, sanctions or not, I mean, even before the sanctions, North Korea wasn't doing well, as I said before, because if you look at any of the basic supply side indicators, North Korea was going nowhere since 1990. It had flatlined. And, with the sanctions in place or with sanctions evasion, you're not going to get economic growth in North Korea. You only get that through systematic reform and opening, as we saw in, say, Vietnam or China.
Okay.
As I said before, worst comes worst. Kim Jong-un can be dictator. He's currently declaring the economic policy of people first. But if he doesn't go well, and at the end of the day, he can be a dictator to secure certain amount of resources, exclusively for the purpose of maintaining his own regime. But I think North Korea is already strategic. I mean, John Park, he's a nice guy, so he praised North Korea as innovative, which I don't want to, but I have to admit that he's correct. But I would coin North Korean posture as more strategic. You look at the currently, what North Korea is doing. China is still maintaining a grip on sanctions to some extent. So North Korea is having difficulty acquiring goods or doing business through China these days. So what is North Korea doing now? They are looking to Russia. And also, when doing business through Russia, they involve more countries for single transaction. For example, when transporting North Korean coal to South Korea, the scheme was for North Korean vessel to go all the way down to a sea close to Indonesia. And the coal was to be transferred on the sea to a Russian cargo vessel. And the vessel was supposed to deliver the coal to South Korea. So single smuggling operation involved Russia, South Korea, and the seller on the contract was provided as a Hong Kong company. And also Indonesian businessman was collaborating to arrange a whole scheme. So 4 countries at the minimum are involved. And you know what? Only the captain of the North Korean cargo vessel was detained by Indonesian authority on the ground of a very simple penalty for failure to declare something. But other people or companies, they are not attributed by any member states at all, including South Korea. Security Council resolution will not change unless United States government agrees. But the implementation of the Security Council resolution is up to each member state. There are a series of Security Council resolutions adopted until the end of 2017. It's been already a year and a half since then. But I'm not aware of information about member states enacting domestic laws to implement Security Council resolutions. But instead I hear more and more voices from member states that, well, if we change laws, I mean, changing law, takes village. It takes really significant amount of effort for bureaucrats. But the moment you change law, you try to change law, but President Trump indicating the lifting sanctions since last year. What's the point of changing laws? So this is a general flavor that is becoming persistent. So without changing resolutions, North Korea, in my view, appears to be trying to be quiet with respect to nuclear and bus missile activities, to the extent that more and more countries will be content and will continue to feel that, well, maybe we don't have to be so stringent about sanctions. I think this is a strategy that Kim Jong-un is pursuing now, and it appears to be going okay for now. One thing about North Korea is that you never make prediction because your prediction is always wrong. But I think they have the ability to adapt strategically and maintain the regime for longer than many expect.
So I would say the analysis is incomplete. I mean, we've traditionally looked inside of North Korea, try to analyze the economy, look at the markets, bottom-up marketization. The piece that has been missing is that it's now diversified. It's gone abroad. And so if you look at core elements of that 1%, it's not a function that they're going to neighboring countries to do business. They're embedded in those countries. That's the new reality. So for me, it's just a fundamental task of doing the diagnosis. Look at the reality of the situation and then try to understand the implications of it. But to your point about the viability of this type of model, it all depends on what framework you use. The framework I use is a family business with nuclear weapons. As a family business, it has to focus really on what its priorities are. It's not burdened by the element of trying to raise the bottom 99% up. So with that, the China piece of it is so crucial. If you look at the visit by then Premier Wen Jiabao in October of 2009, he met with an ailing but recovering Kim Jong-il. He bounced back from a health crisis. The two leaders signed 3 agreements under the headings of economic development, tourism, and education. Under Chinese law, the message was quite clear. If you do business with North Koreans, it's legal. This was an environment of increasing sanctions, and I think this is the turning point. If you look at subsequent efforts from Republican Democratic administrations to pressure the Chinese authorities to implement sanctions, the Chinese response was that this is economic development activity. Under UN Security Council resolutions, there's always this clause saying that member states are not prohibited from engaging in humanitarian and economic development activities. There's your legal loophole. Tourism is a big part of Chinese nationals coming into China, into North Korea, I should say, moving in and out, without visas. So you have the free movement of goods and people. And then with the education component, North Korean workers in China are on learning permits. These are all conduits that are legal under Chinese law. So this is a piece of it where it's a rear view mirror aspect of it. It's not an aspect of what are the implications going forward. These are the realities on the ground. The bottom line in all of this is that the North Korean elites and the North Korean incorporated structure is decentralized. So if you look at it, the most potent members of this apparatus are not in North Korea. And for them to live and do business and essentially be members of expat communities, I think it's long overdue that we use a different type of framework of analyzing this situation.
So, yeah, sure. So identify yourself. And
Yeah, I have a question. Now that North Korea achieved somehow the nuclear status.
Oh, identify yourself first.
Stefan Solvage. Now that North Korea has achieved somehow the nuclear status, even if it's not recognized as such, isn't there a trade-off, a different trade-off between the military expenditures and the more development of economy? Or there were recently, I think, a nomination of a key figure, which meant that the whole team and forces were removed, shifted from the military purpose to more economic purpose. So do you think this will have some impact as well? Or
so essentially, whether nuclear capability is going to allow North Korea to
invest less in nukes and more in the economy? Is it really happening, or is it just...
So redirect the resources from the military to the civilian
part
side.
of them?
So would you like to take a stab?
Go ahead. I'm not aware of this transfer of personnel from military program to civilian program. With respect to nuclear weapons program, Kim Jong-un has been declaring that they're going to develop civilian nuclear power capability since his speech early this year, and followed by his speech just a few weeks ago in the Supreme Assembly. So I think with respect to, for example, nuclear scientists or engineers or workers associated with the nuclear weapons program, my understanding is that they are currently still in the same field, but for different flag or under the, not nuclear weapons program, but nuclear power program. Same may be true for the ballistic missile related people, ballistic missile program related people. Maybe they may be still engaging in a similar program under the banner of space exploration, so a satellite launch program. I mean, originally many North Korean soldiers, they have been engaging in construction projects or farming every year. That has been continuing, but I'm not aware, I don't know any credible information that as a result of the new strategic line adopted by North Korea last year, there was some significant shift of personnel taken away from military sectional weapons sections. Do you know anything?
Well, there are some discussions about that it's a hypothetical situation, but when apparently North Koreans expressed their willingness to lower the level of conventional forces now that they have nuclear weapons. And we know that in North Korean men spent 10 years doing military service. So essentially the same as the Roman soldiers during the Roman Empire era. So for North Korea, or small country like North Korea, they have to, that's a lot of, resources being wasted on defense, knowing that they're technologically, in disadvantage compared to South Korea. So it makes total sense for North Koreans to divert those resources to productive sector from the military. So there's some credence to the argument. So we think the North Koreans are going to do that, but not so sure. So another question? There's like a hand down there. Oh yes, Ambassador.
Just one question. I'm curious. What is the best guess about the importance of foreign workers? Because that is always an issue, how important they are for the North Korean economy. Foreign workers within the country, that's the Kaesong problem, but let's leave that aside. There are quite a few in China. There's speculation that Russia might be interested to have more North Korean workers in the Far East because Russians are not so keen to work there. There seem to be quite a few in the Middle East. So how much of an economic factor are they? Because very often they are presented as a major economic factor, and the earnings then are used for nuclear purposes.
So, John, maybe you know, the figures that I've read, they get about $500 million a year from overseas workers. I mean, I don't know how active they are, which is okay for North Korea, but $500 million is not that much money. I mean, look what the Filipinos make. I forget what it is now. We're talking about billions. 15 billion, 20. I lost touch. So I think it's important. Anecdotally, I remember reading a New York Times story of North Korean workers in the Soviet Far East. I think they were doing home remodeling. Did you read that story? And they're the preferred workers. They work better than the Central Asians, the Chinese, the Russians, and there's a premium on North Korean workers because, as we all know, Koreans generally work very hard. So I guess it's an important source of foreign exchange, but you know, even $500 million isn't all that much money if you're talking about a country that's trying to raise its living standard above a very low level.
Well, $500 million is not much money, but then we also can look at this from a little bit different perspective. North Korea is a country, if you just look at the economic data, North Korea never recorded, apparently, a trade surplus in its economic history. It always lost money from trade.
Well, that's the goods trade reported on Chinese customs statistics.
Well, you know, it's an inference that we can make. So if that's the case, North Korea had to, I mean, if they have a trade account, current account deficit, they have to make that up with capital account surplus. So the surplus has to come from somewhere. So for a long time, we suspected North Korea was engaged in, I mean, it was engaged, not we thought, but actually it was engaged in illicit trade, like weapons trade and trading like, you know, like a counterfeit money, drugs even. But that was replaced in large part by more legal means of making money, such as sending workers abroad. Like, you know, sending workers to like China, Russia, Southeast Asia, Europe, Africa, and sending restaurant workers, you know, it was frequented by South Korean tourists mainly. So that was a huge source of money. So if you, I mean, just look at the official statistics, which is like, you know, questionable to an extent. North Korea was recording like $1 or $2 billion of trade deficit every year, just looking at the trade account. So that means they have to make surplus in their capital account by the similar measure in order to keep the economy afloat. So that means, you know, $500 million was, you know, depending on the year, a bad or a good year, could have accounted for like 50% of their capital account surplus. So I think that's the reason why North Korean regime, even though it was like, you know, peanuts money in many ways, it was more money than that they are earned by exporting like weapons, say, to dwindling number of friendly countries like, you know, like Uganda or like Cuba. So in that sense, the income coming from the overseas workers actually was very useful for the regime. And there's actually added bonus. For instance, the North Korean workers who are posted to Russia, they mainly work in, they start working in like the Siberian logging camps. And the way, I mean, the North Korean workers are compensated directly from the Russian employers, but the money goes directly to the North Korean state, obviously. But the Russian state supplied some of the production, logging production, to North Korean state directly at a cut rate price. We saw that from Russian customs data. So the North Korean regime was getting two types of income by sending overseas workers to Russia. One through wages, the other from the arbitrage. by buying Russian wood at cheaper rate than the market price, and I think they resold also some of the wood to other markets. So the $500 million of wage income is just the surface. I think we suspect that North Koreans made like a side profit here and there. Restaurant workers, for instance, I mean, it's a much smaller scale, obviously, but then the wage income is just like the tip of the iceberg. So if that's the case, North Korea probably was able to make up for much of their, not much, but like a substantial proportion of their trade deficit through this scheme of sending workers abroad.
Just, if I may just say, according to the figure provided by a UK ambassador to United Nations, she mentioned that $800 million income earned by the North Korean workers overseas per year. Compare this figure with the $2,000 million, which is the estimated export value of North Korea. It constitutes around 40% of the estimated export amount of North Korea, annual export of 2017. So it's significant. But as noted, the North Korean economy is really small. So you need more. You need to do more to grow.
Okay. So, yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask if you think there are general lessons to be learned from the North Korean sanction, or is it a very particular case that applies to North Korea and has no bearing on other cases?
Well, I'll take a step first so that I can, the rest of the panel can come up better answer than what I can give you right now. So the North Korean sanctions policy is not just based on the case of North Korea. In many ways, I think the United States has been improving their sanctions regime over time through lessons learned. For instance, we can even say that the origin of U.S. government's current financial sanctions regime that are in place against countries like Iran, Venezuela, Russia, had its genesis in North Korea, when the U.S. State Department and the Treasury Department went after the Bank of Delta Asia in Macau in 2005, I believe. So that's when the U.S. government found out that just targeting a small little bank in Macau, it could inflict a major pain in North Korea. Before then, we thought that North Korea didn't really care about this kind of sanctions because North Korea was juche and all independent, cut off from the rest of the world. So there's nothing that we could really inflict pain on North Korea from the outside. But then we found from Macau that just like touching that node of financial system, it really inflicted huge pain in North Korea, and the amount involved there was only $20 million. So I think that was a major lesson. So that was, then I think the U.S. government took that lesson, and then learned away with it. And I think we saw element of that, not just in North Korea, but Iran policy, especially the way the United States made us financial measures a major centerpiece of their sanctions regime against the country, and targeting the oil and all that. So, but again, we see some element of Iran sanctions in North Korea, the way the U.S. government is targeting North Korea's export and import. So it's like a dialectic, not dialectic, but it's like, goes through, it's a constant learning process, I would say. And we see that the U.S. government actually definitely likes the effectiveness of the sanctions regime. How that really influences other countries' behavior, and even like countries that everybody long thought that was impermeable to outside pressure, such as North Korea. So I think this is, if we go beyond North Korea, I think we are seeing the genesis of another phase of a U.S. foreign policy. I think the U.S. government has probably found an instrument that's not kinetic, that's just equally effective without the, side effect. There's huge side effect because the population suffer. But in my view, I think it really diminishes the cost of conflict, actual conflict, but then could be equally effective from the U.S. policymakers' point of view.
I think countries respond differently to sanctions, and leaders do. Libya is a case where the Libyans and Gaddafi were sick and tired of international isolation and the pain of sanctions, and they decided to have a rapid denuclearization. And they reaped economic benefits for 7 years until the Arab Spring ended the good run they had. I think in South Africa, the sanctions against the apartheid regime worked constructively to help end apartheid, but you had leaders responding differently, and obviously the North Koreans are digging in and trying to withstand the sanctions. So I don't think there's any general lesson. It really depends on what a country and its leaders envisage for the country's future.
If I may add several things. I think sanctions were employed by US or Japanese governments as more of a tool for, a campaign tool. I mean, declaration that we are going to impose you maximum pressure. President Trump or Prime Minister Abe kept shouting. But essentially, sanctions are not for, not to be used for, sanctions are not tool for advertisement of your diplomatic strategy. It's a tool for law enforcement authorities to regulate activities, specific activities. But here's the problem. At the level of UN Security Council resolutions, we input so many tools. If these tools are fully employed by so many UN member states, you could have really instituted a serious sanctions regime against North Korea. But the reality is that in almost a majority of UN member states, the bureaucracy have, they're so resistant to any change of their laws. And as John Park stated, for a majority of member states, they don't consider North Korea as an enemy or business activity with North Korea is bad. Therefore, no change in the law. Then you have a very good sanction tool authorized by international laws, but no member states use it. I think this is the reality. And particularly, there are elements, the fields currently cultivated by North Korea to evade sanctions, money laundering, or smuggling through shipping networks, or cyber attack operations. All these, in each of all these fields, in each member states, multiple ministries or agencies are related to money laundering, cyber attacks. There's no single responsible government agency. So it requires intricate interagency coordination, which we don't see so much as we stand today. So North Korea, in my view, the way they evade sanctions are, they are loyal, or they are loyal to the basics. They thoroughly implementing the very basics of how to evade laws, and the member states are not able to meet with the challenge. That's a problem I think we see today.
I would just add a slightly different angle to that. If you go down this path of interdictions and more sanctions, embargoes, isolating North Korea more and more, you could see the phenomenon of what's called coal liquefaction, turning coal into oil. We saw that with World War II Germany, World War II Japan, apartheid South Africa. So it's this iterative game of adaptation. That's the part that we spark these improvements. It's not to say that it's to our detriment solely. You have to keep up with those improvements. But that's the element of just going after these measures. Like, what is the broader game plan? I think one of the lessons from Iran is that if sanctions are a part of a game plan, then they can be effective. But if it's just sanctions for sanctions' sake, then you're going to trigger these type of responses where, the decision making is going to go to the 1%. And I think we're already seeing that.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. Italian Embassy. So my question relates to the North Korean diplomatic missions abroad and their role in avoiding sanctions and help the regime to get maybe luxury goods or doing smuggling activities. So what is your assessment about the share of North Korean diplomatic missions activities abroad in supplying the regime with prohibited items and, you know, in giving a lifeline to the regime?
I would say 100%, but then, I think Katsuhisa can give you a better answer.
I can't give you any quantitative here, but it's significant because almost all key incidents of serious sanctions violations, embassy or North Korean trade representatives abroad have played a significant role in arranging for the entire scheme of providing logistics support. But they play a key role, but they are not the only one who play the key role. There are North Korean agents hired by the local companies of other countries. So they also pretend to be operating as a Malaysian trading agent or Chinese trader, but in fact they're North Koreans. There are multiple of them still based in other countries. So DPRK embassy and trade representatives abroad kind of serve as a hub of coordination of those agents or foreign collaborators of different countries. And these activities have not been stopped as yet, which is a problem.
John?
Yeah, I was just going to mention there that the North Korean businessmen that I mentioned, the ones who are embedded and living in these commercial hubs, engaged in illegal activities, they're North Korean diplomats in many instances. That's the way that they're able to live for years on end in these places. But as Katsu mentioned, it's not that they're doing all the activities by themselves. They're essentially running networks with local partners. And it's the growth of the networks and the greater sophistication of these local networks that I think is the game changer. But certainly the embassies and the consulates have a very important role. It's not the wave of North Koreans and the elites going abroad. It's more of these individuals who are embedded doing larger and larger activities, again, with growing and more sophisticated local networks.
So the North Korean diplomats have been self-financing their cost of being posted abroad ever since the economic collapse in the 90s. So one interesting factoid about that is that was when we start seeing an increase in the number of press reports of North Korean diplomats engaged in illicit activities like smuggling alcohol in Islamic countries, tobacco is one case in point, counterfeit money, or even like exotic animal parts from Africa, like rhino, like in the horn and that kind of stuff, used in Eastern medicine. So we have seen the increase, actually explosion of this kind of media reports in the 90s and in some parts of the 2000s. But around past the mid-2000s, those reports went away. So you can use that as an indication that North Korean diplomats start engaging on more, start avoiding engaging in this kind of illicit activities when the economic situation started improving a little bit better. It became better. So in that sense, I would say North Korean diplomats engaged in direct, in illicit activities in a direct manner. It's probably dwindled to a small number of cases, but I think the North Korean diplomats, assistance in illicit activities, moved on to another dimension, I would say. I think in many countries, like in the Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia, North Korean embassies serve as a hub of North Korea's commercial activities in the country. They coordinate different activities, and even they have people companies' addresses that overlap with the address of the embassies there. So in that sense, I think North Korean embassies are serving as a HQ or a command center for North Korea's external economy in different countries. They coordinate activities regarding not just trade, but also procurement of luxury goods in case of Europe, and also coordinate the use of North Korean overseas workers in case of Russia, China, and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So it's a different dimension of illicit activity now. So in that sense, I would say North Korean diplomatic corps is involved in illicit activities, but then it's in a gray area, I would say, in many ways. So we're going to get one final question. It's almost like the end of the session. So how would you like to ask one last question that could really define the session? Okay, so okay, no takers? Okay, so if that's the case, yeah, it's been a long session. It's thank you so much for staying at such a late hour. It's almost like 10:30, and I think we get a lot out of this terrific panel we had today. So, I mean, I think hopefully I learned a lot myself, and so please give a big round of applause to the panel that stayed so late.